My name's Adam, and let's just get into it. This is how every mythology is secretly the same. By me. Alright, let's just get started into this video. So, our main mythologies that we're focusing on today is Greece, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. Remember, this is ancient history. So, Greece, our main sources we're going to be using are the Theogony by Hesiod, the Pseudo-Apollodorus Bibliotheca, and Homer's Epics. Now, for Mesopotamia, our main sources are from the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish, and various mythology and archaeology compiled across the Fertile Crescent. And for Egypt, we're going to have these inscriptions and artifacts and writings because there's not one big collective source of this. This includes the pyramid texts, all of that. You can find it in temples everywhere. Okay, so we can already see some astounding similarities between each of these cultures. For example, they're all believed in this chaos origin. And it also has an earth and sky couple that emerge from this chaos. However, Egypt does first have a floating lotus on a pyramid, but that doesn't really matter because afterwards the earth and sky couple emerge. So it's still very, very similar. Of course, they have a bunch of god kids that all kill each other and usurp their uncles. And one of them becomes the king of the gods. And somehow, in all of this, there has to be some kind of way of somebody getting dissected in a certain way. And of course, there's incest, because this is mythology we're talking about. So, just for some context on how these astoundingly different cultures can all come together to create a seemingly cohesive story and mythology, we have to look at the history part of this, because remember, cultures change over time. So let's start with Sumer over here. Sumer was the very first origins of society as we know it today. And they emerged around 3200 BC when they started actually getting powerful, but they managed to have a very, very long history due to their geography and climate. And this area is around Kuwait. For Egypt follows three main dynasties, as you can see with my mouse. The Old, the Middle, and the New Kingdoms, with intermittent periods and pre-dynastic periods. Now, Greece, however, has a completely different story. Its origins in Greece actually originate in an island called Crete. This is the very origin of Greek culture. And eventually it shifted mainland to Mycenae, which started the Mycenaean Age. After a while, the Greek sources suddenly, between this era and the Dark Age, just stopped before emerging in the three classic periods that are very famous about Greece. And down here we have the Phoenician era. So one very important thing to note about the Phoenician era is that it was both conquered by Egypt and the Assyrian Empire, which has Mesopotamian culture. Very, very important. So here is the trade routes that we can see from here. This is Phoenicia right here, and culture from Mesopotamia and eastward flowed to Phoenicia and spread across the Mediterranean Sea. These circles represent cultural hubs. So let's just take a look at Mycenaean mythology, because this is before the heavy spreading of this religion across the Mediterranean Sea. We could start with these somewhat familiar gods, but we're missing a lot of them. And as you could see here, a lot of them have very similar names, and we're able to piece together by deciphering their language called Linear B. This is a very, very actually and somewhat spooky religion, as it is very similar to ancient Greece, but yet so unique and different with these strange names and unknown history. So, we could notice 4 gods that actually don't exist, but you could commonly see in the Greek pantheon: Apollo, Aphrodite, Hades, and Hestia. However, Hades and Hestia, Hades likely actually came from the original Poseidon, and Hestia was likely never actually documented in Mycenaean culture. Remember, the Mycenaean Greece had a lot less information given to us than actual ancient Greece. So, possibly Hestia existed because she is definitely Greek originated. It's just we don't see any sources of her in Mycenaean Greece. So, mainly, we're just gonna look at Apollo and Aphrodite. So let's take a look at Apollo. You should be very familiar with Apollo, and he's commonly depicted with the bow, and he has the epithet Pythian Apollo because he slayed the monster Python, as referenced in Ovid's Metamorphoses and Pseudo-Apollodorus' Bibliotheca. Also, there's one very famous story of Apollo about being humbled by Hermes. Hermes steals Apollo's cattle and tricks Apollo by flipping the cattle's hooves so it looks like they're going in the other direction. Yet somehow Hermes entices Apollo with a lyre made out of a turtle shell and cow intestines. This is very, very important. So, if you're familiar with Assyrian, specifically Assyrian culture, because remember, during the Dark Ages, where the Greek culture shifted from Mycenaean to classical, Phoenicia was ruled by the Assyrians. So if we look at Assyrian mythology, we could find one very, very similar god called Ninurta. He is very, very, very commonly depicted like Apollo, and there's a story about Ninurta and the turtle. Ninurta slays the monstrous demon Abzu, but is later humbled by Enki by enticing him with the clay turtle. Very, very spooky. So let's take a look at Aphrodite. Aphrodite has this special story of where she was born out of, let's just say, Uranus's castrated testicles. Anyway, she has 3 separate epithets, one of the heavenly meaning, the other one of for the people, and the last one war related. And she's also associated with the Adonis myth. But this would actually be talked about later. This is a very, very important part of piecing together this puzzle. So let's take a look at Ishtar. Very, very popular, especially in Assyria, Akkadian, and Sumer. She goes by other names like Inanna in Sumer and Astarte in Phoenicia, but I'll be referring to her as Ishtar or Inanna. She is associated with almost the exact same things as Aphrodite, and based off of some versions, she was born out of Anu's testicles after being bitten off. Yes. And she is referred to as the Queen of the Gods, which is very, very similar to Aphrodite's epithet of Uranus, which means heavenly like. And she's also famous for the Damuzi myth, which is surprisingly similar to the Adonis myth. So, now we could see that both of these goddesses are very similar to Isis in Egypt. And she has also the Queen of Heaven epithet and is famous for the Osiris myth, where Osiris is missing his genitals. So now let's take a look at what I've been foreshadowing for a while, the Adonis / Damuzi / Osiris myth. They are all surprisingly similar. If you could just read here, it seems like Adonis, Damuzi, and Osiris play a very, very similar role in this story. And this story goes, love goddess descends into underworld and then comes out of underworld with somebody staying in the underworld for half the time. This is very, very, very good example of how we call cultural syncretism. So let's get into this. So cultural syncretism, which means that cultures can be alike even though they're separately and distinct. So these are 4 ways it could happen. 1, colonization. Remember earlier when I talked about how Assyria conquered Phoenicia? That's how the Assyrian culture and Mesopotamian culture spread to Phoenicia. But even before that, actually one of the most powerful ones is trade. Because when you're trading for us, and this is, by the way, on the scale of thousands of years, if you have 2 countries that trade with each other, their culture slowly spreads to one another. Then we have migration. An example of a migration, say, is the migration of Jewish people outside of Egypt, as cited in Genesis. The migration helps spread the culture by people, not goods. And last one is globalization. But globalization was not as common back then, as there was no technology. Nowadays, globalization is a big thing on making cultural syncretism, specifically in America. Alright, so let's go back to our timeline and let's just review it a little bit, because this is very important. Because as you could see, Phoenicia has been trading with all of these places at the same time. So even before it was under Assyrian rule. This means that culture could have got from all the way across the world to Greece and Egypt. Of course, that's hyperbole. So let's look at trade caused cultural syncretism. We start with Ishtar. Then it became Astarte in Phoenicia, and that eventually turned into Aphrodite and Isis. So, for all of you mythology nerds out there who may be like, oh my god, that's not correct, all of this and that, this is, of course, just speculation. We don't know anything for a fact, as we don't have time machines. And likely Isis did not just directly come from Astarte, but came from another. So, here's the Typhon myth. Alright, because this is a very, very huge, big example on how this works. And let me just explain it to you now. Gaia, the earth goddess, sends a monster, Typhon, and takes over Olympus. And the Greek gods run away in disguise as animals. This was the way of the Greeks saying that, oh, the Egyptians aren't incorrect. We're correct, but they're also semi-correct. They're just worshipping our gods in a different form. So this is the Greeks' way of actually visualizing and depicting that the Greek gods are similar to the Egyptian ones. And this is coming thousands of years before I'm saying this. And the Greeks actually believed and observed the similarities between Egyptian and Greek culture. So let's take a look at this. Zeus turned into a ram, turning into Amun-Ra, the sky god. Artemis turned into a cat, becoming Bastet. Hermes turned into an ibis, becoming Thoth, which actually makes sense. Apollo becoming a falcon, which turned into Horus/Montu. Montu is often depicted as a falcon, and in later periods was syncretized with Horus. Hera turned into a cow, which represents Hathor. Dionysus, a goat, which is the ba of Osiris, and Aphrodite, a fish. Now notice Dionysus turns into a goat, because Dionysus is actually heavily associated with underworld and resurrection, which is very, very strange because Osiris was resurrected too. Now, about this fish, you'd be like, Adam, oh my god, you lied to me. Aphrodite is not actually Isis in disguise, you lied. Well, this fish god is actually secretly Isis. Take a look at this. Hot Mehit, Isis. You notice the difference? Yeah, exactly. Just one difference between them. And I'm guessing the Greeks could not observe the difference and often mix the two up. Remember, of course this is all speculation, but we could see Ishtar, Aphrodite, and Isis being related in some way. Now, do you know what this means? This means that there could be millions of other possibilities on where gods originated. And this is all down to you. You need to be able to observe. You need to be able to do your own research. Learn about the world. And I encourage you, please, question things. Question things, because sometimes a lot of people say things, but you need to be able to believe things yourself. Anyway, that's all I have today. Until next time, my name's Adam, and this is Yap Academy.